So I haven't done a map update in a while, and it's just because not a lot has taken place on the battlefield. The big focus has been on moving a few meters here or there in Bakhmut, but now that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has started, I will do these more often, and I'm also going to focus on Bakhmut. So with the counteroffensive launching, and the reason we can say it's launched is we now see Western equipment on the battlefield engaging and being engaged. So largely that was what the Ukrainians were going to use, Western equipment along with their own equipment. So I'm going to focus on two areas today, the Zaporizhia region right here, as well as Bakhmut, which is right there. And we'll go ahead and get started by talking first about Zaporizhia. So I'm going to zoom in here and talk about what has gone on recently. So Ukrainian forces conducted somewhat limited but larger than usual attacks towards the southwest in Zaporizhia, and they originated out of Orikhiv right here, and the attacks basically were trying to push towards Polahi. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but oh well. And the attacks were running along a line that ran from Robotine to Luhaviske here. So, and again, if I'm pronouncing these wrong, I'm sorry. And so the attack was largely in this direction to try and retake territory. So the Ukrainians, for the first time, used brigades equipped with Western equipment and launched this attack. The Ukrainian forces aimed to break through this defensive line, which, when you look at the entirety of the lines, when I toggle the, let's say I toggle this, in general, when you zoom out, let me delete these things. When you zoom out, you can see that this is an area where it seems like the Russians were weakest. So it was just a limited attack to try and find weakness here. It's not indicative of a major full brunt combined arms attack. However, that being said, it still was a significant attack nonetheless. Ukrainian forces initially broke through, and they broke through potentially all the way to a line that runs about here. That's about where the Ukrainians broke through, but eventually the Russians pushed the Ukrainians back to their original positions in Russian counterattacks on this. So Russian sources claim that their successes in pushing the Ukrainians back was their use of electronic warfare systems and air support, as well as they've been placed a lot of landmines throughout this area, and I'll talk about those landmines in a bit and their effect. So the Russian electronic warfare severely interfered with Ukrainian command and control signals and GPS devices, as well as their drones, their UAVs. So this was largely a successful defense by Russia. They had to fall back. The Russians fell back, but then pushed them back to the original line. So we're back to square one. The reason basically the Ukraine struggled is the Ukrainians have insufficient air defenses on the battlefield, and the Russians have very large amounts of attack helicopters in the battlefield. In fact, the largest amount of attack helicopters they've had since the beginning of the war. Russia also launched a large amount of fixed-wing attack aircraft, such as their jet aircraft, not just rotary wing, to target Ukrainian tanks and fighting vehicle movements in this region. So the intended effect of Russia's continuous missile and drone attacks in Kyiv and the infrastructure of Ukraine diverted a lot of Ukraine's advanced air defense systems, their Patriots, away from the front line to those cities, to defend those cities. And this has given Russia an edge in the region. It has allowed Russia to be more successful in conducting air sorties, which, when you own the air, it makes defending ground attacks much easier. Now, Ukrainian forces, there's some visually confirmed data that Ukrainian forces left behind at least one Leopard tank, 4 Bradleys, which are fighting vehicles, that 3 were damaged, and then 1 BMR-2 mine clearing tank as well. So there are losses. Now, the June 8th attack in this region, I need to stress, this was a limited attack. This was not a full push on the counteroffensive. It was trying to find weak points in the Russian defenses, potentially setting up for future attacks, setting up for future feints. But it was an attack that technically the Ukrainians came out on the losing end, or at least it was a failed attack. Ukraine has conducted a lot of the coordinated and effective offensive operations before, and they've done this without Western tanks and NATO training, which a lot of these soldiers are NATO trained, and there are Western tanks involved. But again, this was limited. It was only 1 to 2 brigades. Ukraine has 12 or more dedicated counteroffensive brigades. 9 of them are equipped with Western equipment, and 3 of them have existing Ukrainian equipment. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive operations are going to vary. They're going to be different sizes, and it will be joined by experienced Ukrainian units that have been trained by Western trainers. So this isn't indicative of an overall failure of the counteroffensive. You have to understand that many of these counteroffensives are a series of attacks that take weeks to months, and not to get too overly concerned. Now, this is not to say the Russians aren't prepared. The Russians actually are pushing their higher quality troops to this front in order to counter what everyone has known for a while as the counteroffensive points. Now, the defensive performance of the Russians in this area isn't necessarily indicative of how good they will perform across the entire front line here. As we've seen, and I'll talk about in a bit, Bakhmut, there are some situations in which Russia is failing there. So the initial pushes for the first attacks to find weakness favored Russia, but now I will move up to Bakhmut. I'm going to clear these graphics out because they're just everywhere. So moving to Bakhmut, we do see Ukrainian successes here. So Ukrainians have advanced about 2 kilometers inward towards Bakhmut on the flanks. So no big pushes in the center, but on the flanks you can see Ukraine has taken a pretty significant amount of territory in these regions here, these blue areas. They have forced elements of Russia's 57th Motorized Infantry Brigade to actually retreat in these regions. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that Wagner Group has left. There's still some rear echelon elements of Wagner Group here, but the 57th Motorized Infantry Brigade has taken over, and they are finding large amounts of struggles, and especially on the flank. So the brigade generally is the Motorized Infantry Brigade, the Russian brigade is generally operating in this region right here, but the flanks are being ran by the 5th Combined Arms Army, which is filled with what they call the convict servicemen, or of the Storm Z unit out of the various Russian prisons and stuff. So this is where Ukraine is actually seeing some successes as they try to retake Bakhmut. Now the question is, why focus on Bakhmut if we've been talking about how it's not tactically significant for the Russians? Why is it tactically significant for the Ukrainians? Well, it's not necessarily, but it is a victory in the headspace of the Kremlin if the Ukrainians can retake Bakhmut. In fact, another big reason is there's a significant amount of troops in this region. So re-engaging the graphics here, I'll clear out my markings and kind of zoom out. You can see that there's a significant portion of forces here that, if the Ukrainians are successful, could capture, destroy, or force a retreat of these forces, and that is a significant victory. So focusing in this region is not necessarily tactically unsound, because, as you remember, Ukraine is trying to win a war of attrition here. They're trying to kill more Russians than Russians can gain land. And as they do that, that war of attrition will slowly favor Ukraine going forward. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Very limited attacks. I know people have been waiting because the counteroffensive has begun, but in the initial stages, looking at the counteroffensive, when looking at Zaporizhia, zooming out, the Zaporizhia region down here, it's been largely unsuccessful for Ukraine so far. But again, very, very early stages. It took many weeks of feints and planning, etc., for them to conduct the counteroffensive operations that took place up in the Kharkiv region up here. And they don't have the element of surprise like they did in Kherson. The Russians have been largely expecting this, so this is going to be a highly defended area, and we need to expect that Western equipment is not invincible. It's going to be destroyed, and that's something to keep in mind, but I still think that the Ukrainians can prevail in this situation.